going to splice you in with the Jason Kidd presser, give you some shine here too.
Okay.
So the last time we reconvened was the J Kidd presser.
Yeah.
What did you make of the whole press conference? Obviously, you got your question in.
I thought for the most part it went the way that I think they wanted it to go, because it's hard to – this organization really did not give the kind of – I mean, when Donnie Nelson was essentially fired, you know, after 24 years, the transition was like, okay, now how do you move forward from here? You know, you start identifying, you know, Kidd potentially as a head coaching, you know, candidate. But I thought the presser itself was businesslike and professional. I think there was some, I don't want to use the word dodging of the questions, but I think if you got that sense by some of the answers that, you know, Sent Marshall or Mark Cuban or Kidd even gave in terms of his quote-unquote journey that he's been on and what that looks like in terms of evaluation by the organization, you know, as far as the decision to make him head coach, I could see where, you know, some folks may have felt like they did not answer the questions the way that they needed to. I think, you know, part of our job is to ensure that, you know, obviously you get these folks warmed up a little bit in terms of some of the questions, and then, okay, now we came here to try to handle some kind of business, to really give answers to folks who had real questions about not just the basketball side of things, but why, with this organization's history, would you hire this coach relative to his own history? And I think those questions had to be asked. And I thought, you know, some individuals really tried to get some of those answers. I mean, you know, shout out to the folks like, you know, Tim Cato of The Athletic. I thought Maria Guerrero of NBC5 asked the most poignant question with respect to, you know, his past and why this organization felt. What message would you send to those who feel like this hire was the wrong one? But at the same time, it's part of his story and his narrative, and it's the same for the Mavericks, and it had to be dealt with. So I think as time goes on, Kidd has a chance to be an advocate and someone who can speak to growth and development while still trying to be the face of an organization that's looking to him to lead going forward.
Are you confident in the Kidd fit more than you might have been just hearing about it after the presser?
Yeah, I think a little bit more, because, you know, a guy who was, 183 and 190 as a head coach, and in two previous stops, only one playoff series win during that time. But you saw the development of a guy in Giannis when he was in Milwaukee. You saw some of that a little bit, you know, in his first stop in Brooklyn, but it was a different situation in Brooklyn, you know, with aging veterans and trying to get the most out of a group that really didn't have much left toward the end anyway. But then he goes to Milwaukee, and you get a Giannis, a raw player who's still growing and developing, and you were able to get him to the point where you could see, oh, this is why Giannis was drafted. This is why this organization, the Bucks, believed in what he could do. And now to see that come full circle with Giannis winning his first NBA championship and him himself giving credit
in the presser,
you know, to Jason Kidd for part of his development, I think is huge. But for Kidd, he's got to create, to me, the kind of buy-in from day one, starting with his superstar in Luka Doncic. I mean, we know what kind of basketball IQ Jason Kidd has, but some of the issues that he's had throughout his career is his inability to be a good communicator, you know, at times throwing, you know, certain players under the bus, being a perfectionist, being too harsh in terms of some of his criticism of his players, especially when he was in Milwaukee. Can he evolve to the kind of coach that's needed for this young group, young-ish, I should say, but it's superstar who's ready to win now? Is he in a position now to have learned from Frank Vogel and LeBron James and the Lakers the last couple of years to be in that spot to do it? That, to me, is the ultimate question right now.
Are you convinced enough on the basketball stuff that Kidd and Luka are the right pairing, or do you need to see games before you even go there?
I need to see it. I mean, Kidd as a player, a creator, a facilitator, one of the best to ever do it, there were things that he saw on a basketball court that just made your head turn. That how did he see that? How did he do that? Luka does a lot of those same things, but he's also a terrific scorer who's evolved his game to the point where you look at him, Luka's a 3-level scorer, can get to the rim anytime he wants to, can make things happen from a facilitation, a passing. Like, he can do pretty much everything on the floor. What does Jason Kidd do from a mental standpoint to elevate Doncic's game even more when you've got a guy at 22 who has a high of a basketball IQ as he already does? What does Jason Kidd add other than obviously the experience of being in the NBA and being a player that played essentially the same position but was never the kind of scorer that Doncic was? That's the part where I want to see, can he help elevate Luka from a mental and a basketball standpoint to get something out of him that maybe Rick Carlisle would have never been able to have pulled out of him? But does he run the kind of offensive system that not only gets Doncic the best out of him, but it doesn't look like this team is going to move on from, Kristaps, Porzingis? How do you figure out to get the best way to those two to fit together? And then defensively, you tried some different things in Milwaukee. It worked out for a little while there with some of the blitzing things that they were doing defensively, but then the league caught up and Kidd really didn't evolve defensively the way that he needed to, because this team's problem last year, really the last couple of years, is defensively they haven't been very good. So how does Kidd surround himself with a staff that's going to more so get this team to play better defense while also accentuating their strengths, as an offensive team?
It's interesting as well because Kidd was sort of the start of that point guard coming straight from retirement into coaching. You had Kidd, then it went Kerr and Fisher, and Nash has kind of seen the peak of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's to me it's hard to because like those Warriors teams, I mean, no disrespect to Kerr, but you could drop a lot of guys in there. and you're gonna get
Mark Jackson would beg to differ, but
you're gonna get some results. Let's just say some results. With the team assembled there. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if Kidd can move past Milwaukee, Brooklyn, into becoming what he wants to be as a coach.
Yeah, I think part of it is that he skipped several steps in the coaching process. As you mentioned, he went straight from being a player to a head coach immediately. And I think the last couple of years, hopefully for him, has given him a chance to kind of step back, learn how to be a better listener, better communicator. One of the things he's talked about is how Frank Vogel, not only from a game plan standpoint, put things together, but how he took in ideas, listened to his players, and was able to really be a much better communicator and listener. And I think Kidd saw a lot of those things, and it's hard not to see it when you're working with, one of the best basketball players to have ever played in LeBron James, and seeing how he goes about his business and working with Vogel. So I think Kidd has that chance to show that evolution, but he's going to have to do that fairly quickly to prove to Doncic and his team that they are willing to buy what he's selling and to do it to where they can win. Because this team needs to win, fairly quickly to prove that, to me, that this experiment with bringing Kidd back is going to ultimately be a successful one.
One thing about the presser that I was a little bit surprised at is we still haven't really gotten adequate, I don't know if adequate's the right word, but we still haven't gotten the side of the Mavs front office, Mark Cuban's side of what happened with Carlisle, what happened with Donnie. Does that matter anymore, or do fans need to know what happened in terms of the rift there?
Well, I think there was enough tea leaves when it came to Carlisle about why
that was the domino effect.
Exactly.
But Donnie.
The Donnie part is a little more interesting to me because this was a man who was in your organization for 24 years and was with you during the highs and lows of your tenure, as an owner so far in this league. And, his international scouting and player, finding has been long renowned when it comes to Nelson, but his inability really, especially the last 10 years, to secure the kind of quote unquote stars and free agents to sustain that kind of success was really puzzling, given all the advantages that a team in a city like this should present to you. So Cuban, throughout his time has decided who he's wanted to listen to, when he's wanted to listen to him. You remember the years when he was out here listening to Chandler Parsons about who he would want to see on his team after, he brought him in here, and we saw how that ultimately worked out. But I think the Nelson and the Vulgaris stuff is still there. It's still there. Even when Nico Harrison, talked to our station 105.3 The Fan, he talked about, I haven't necessarily met Paul Vulgaris yet. Don't know if he's going to be around, this upcoming season. And I'm just like, that's really curious, because one of the reasons why we're here is because Vulgaris became a very central figure to this story about how certain folks in the organization felt about him, enough to the point where they had to talk about him, and it became the kind of story that it did. So there's a lot of still questions I think that have to be answered. And for Cuban, I don't know if he'll be necessarily wanting to answer those questions. He'll just want to probably just look forward and say, hey, we've got Harrison and Kidd in here. It's a new regime, a new time, and we're not looking back.
Well, yeah, he didn't answer the Vulgaris question at the presser. He said he wouldn't comment on.
He wouldn't comment on people who are on the payroll. Meanwhile, we're talking to folks that are on the payroll in the middle of a press conference, but that's neither here nor there, I guess, for Cuba.
There are a lot of free agents linked to this team, and a lot of pie in the sky, a lot of probably real interest. We've heard Dame, Rashawn Holmes, DeMar, Kyle, Conley, a lot of guys. Obviously, more pie in the sky trades. Beal has always been.
Right.
I believe there's reports he's requesting a trade. Who knows? But what do you see as most realistic for the Mavs, and what do you think makes sense, given that I believe it's a fair assumption KP's here, and obviously we need to build around Luka. So, what do you think fits the most from what you've assessed?
It really depends, because it's amazing how these free agency decisions hinge on what this team decides to do with Tim Hardaway, because Hardaway just completed a near $72 million deal where realistically he could go to the open market, in my mind, and get somewhere between $18 to $20 million a season from someone.
And can I stop you there for a second? Do you think Tim Hardaway is actually, because people were saying, at the time before, we saw the numbers with Luka, people were saying, it was an overpaid contract. It was this overpaid salary. Do you think Tim can increase on that salary?
I think so. But it'll be depending on the situation that he goes to, because Tim is a guy that needs someone to facilitate his offense for him. He's not a great, creator of his own offense, but he's a terrific catch and shoot guy. And if you put him around somebody who could facilitate his ability to shoot from the 3-point line, or put him in a situation where he's coming off the bench and being some of that, that instant offense, Tim has shown that he can flourish in either one of those situations. But the question is, do you want to pay him the kind of money long term to keep him here, when if you renounce Tim Hardaway, you're in essence opening yourself up, especially if Josh Richardson decides to decline his player option. We're talking about a team that could have around $34 million, in cap space, which means, okay, now you're in play for the Kawhi Leonards of the world, to a lesser extent the Chris Pauls of the world, depending on some salary cap gymnastics that you try to, to do to get him here. But realistically, names to me, guys like Rashawn Holmes, Norman Powell, Spencer Dinwiddie to a lesser degree. Now he's asking, from reports I've seen, he wants that $125 million, 25 mil per year type deal, which maybe he gets that from somebody. I don't know if he would necessarily get that potentially, but to me, those are the kinds of realistic names. When you start thinking about secondary ball, handlers and playmakers, guys who are athletic bigs who can get up and down the floor, like Rashawn Holmes can get up and down the floor, shoots the ball at a high percentage. was a pretty good, shot blocker and defender. You got guys like John Collins, who's a restricted, free agent in Atlanta. I don't see him going anywhere because of the deep playoff run that they just had and him being a central part
Atlanta
of that.
Would likely to match anyways.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and they can match. So those to me are some of the realistic names, but it all depends on what they decide to do with Tim Hardaway. Because if you decide to sign Tim Hardaway back, you're pretty much
out of it.
Done at that point. And if Josh Richardson, decides to opt into his player option, okay, now how do you look to move off of him in terms of a trade? Because I don't know if he necessarily fits long term what the Mavericks are trying to do here, given how disappointing he was, this past season.
Can I ask you about Josh for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
Did you put any of that on Rick, or was that on Josh's play?
Josh's role to me was fairly simple, I thought, which was, when you trade away Seth Curry, you're giving up a guy who's an elite three-point shooter, literally an all-time three-point shooter from a percentage standpoint, but you're trading it for a guy who you think can provide you the kind of perimeter defense that Seth could not give you, because Seth is a revolving door, as a perimeter defender. But Josh's role was to come in here, defend, multiple positions on the perimeter, and be a competent three-point shooter. And he really didn't do much of any of that in a consistent way. And then toward later in the season, you tried to bench him, get him to come off the bench a little bit, which I thought he did okay at, and a little bit later on in the season. But I just don't know if the fit is good for him here, given what his skill set is and what he should have been able to provide. Now, he, had COVID and dealt with some real, health issues, had some nagging injuries, as the season went on. But I thought for what you gave up and what you got from him in terms of a production standpoint, it wasn't what you were expecting from Josh, I thought.
For sure. And you brought up a huge name there, and Kawhi Leonard as well. Are you on, if Kawhi opts out or the Clippers feel ready to move on given the injury, are you on the, hey, let's stash Kawhi thought process? Are you intrigued by that at all?
Yes.
Yes, even though if he's out for the entire season.
Yes. I mean, you're talking about arguably the best two-way player in the game, and if it means I got to wait most of a year to know that he's going to come back and play alongside Luka Doncic, who's going to be locked into his rookie max extension for the next, 4 or 5 years, yeah, I'll wait on that. Because Luka's already proven to me that he can get me to at least 7 games in a first-round conference, with minimal help. Maybe he gets me to a second round this year, which means, okay, now that I know that Kawhi is coming, who potentially in free agency or via trade or whatever you want to say would look at my situation if I'm Doncic and say, well, he got into a second round, Kawhi's coming. If I'm a free agent or someone who may be in a situation where I want to leave, I'm going to look at Dallas and say, I might be that guy that can help get them over the top with Kawhi coming back. Yeah, I would stash Kawhi away and wait for the year and then take my chances from
now,
there.
Let me ask you this as well, because if Kawhi is available, but also other guys are available, the DeMars, the Kyle Lowrys, some of the guys we mentioned, are you still picking Kawhi over the guy who gives you the help right away?
If Kawhi wants to come here, I'm picking him over
the field.
Over the field, even with the injury. Because the way the roster is constructed right now, they're in a really weird kind of spot, honestly, because let's say you don't clear out the requisite cap space, or let's say you do, and you're able to get Kawhi Leonard, but you got to wait for a year before you get him. You're not really in a position with the assets that you have to make other moves, via trade or those kinds of things, or even draft-wise, to try and improve your roster in the interim, because, you've hitched some of your best assets and picks that are gone from the Porzingis trade. You're really not in the position free agency-wise to go after the kinds of big-time free agents that you think you can get to improve the roster immediately. So what can you really do? Like, you're kind of stuck, honestly, unless you're able to turn renouncing, Tim Hardaway Jr. and hoping that Josh Richardson declines his player option into somebody who would want to come here, namely, a Kawhi Leonard. So if Kawhi says no, then maybe DeMar DeRozan is going to be 32, Kyle Lowry, in his, mid-30s now at this point too. Okay, now that's where you start to turn, I would think, based on some of that.
So Kawhi and then work your way down.
Yeah. I think that's how any team that looks at this year's free agency class is going to – I mean, it's Kawhi.
Well, I guess he has to opt out too, right? I guess I think there was reports he was going to, but then he didn't know he was going
to. Yeah, which would make sense for Kawhi. Opt out, try to see if you get a long-term deal done, either with the Clippers or somewhere else, because someone – regardless.
Well, I mean, you could argue both sides. It makes sense to opt in to guarantee yourself another 35 because you don't know what some guys could be the end for Kawhi too, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you that as well. Are you concerned about the injury history with Kawhi? Because at this point, not a doctor, just play one on TV, but like, I mean, you could make a case. I wouldn't. I'm on the fence, right? I'm on the fence, but you could make a case he's damaged, permanently at this point because he was already, in a spot where he's being load managed for 2 years in a row. The quad was a real issue.
Yeah. That doesn't necessarily scare me off, honestly. It doesn't scare me off because the talent and skill level of the player is worth the risk. Because you look how Brooklyn, it's the same in essence with Kevin Durant, coming off of his, Achilles. You take the risk on the player and hope that you have a medical staff and team that will get him in the position to where he comes back, that he will be at least most of the player that he was pre-injury. Kawhi's injury as an ACL isn't nearly as devastating relative to, an Achilles injury usually for basketball players is a kiss of death because it's very difficult to come back from an Achilles. Look, what Kevin Durant just did this past season is kind of insane when you think about the level of game that he was playing at.
Still playing, too.
And still playing. Yeah, he's playing with Team USA. It's really, a marvel to think about. And I think Kawhi, because any team to me that signs Kawhi is going to have to get on board and play ball with the folks who he trusts in terms of how they manage his health. And I think that's one of the advantages that a Mavericks team could have when they look at Kawhi and his situation, if he does ultimately opt out and they try to pursue him, is that they can present to Kawhi, well, we've got one of the best, if not the best, medical staff in the NBA with Casey Smith and the work that he's done throughout his time with the organization. How willing is the Mavericks medical staff willing to play ball with Kawhi's people to ensure that they come up with a plan that will help him not only recover and rehab, but also get him to the player that he was and maybe even better once he comes back from the ACL. To me, that's an advantage that the Mavericks could have in trying to pursue Kawhi in my mind.
All right, we just mentioned KD with Team USA. I want to segue to the Olympics here.
Mm-hmm.
If Luka is able to medal with Slovenia, just a bronze. You know what? Let's let Team USA has had turmoil. Let's go for the gold here.
Okay.
If Luka is able to medal, win silver or gold, how would you rank that accomplishment? Is how monumental would that be to beat Team USA potentially?
If Doncic gets Slovenia to the podium, that is pretty remarkable because, obviously Team USA, Australia's got a really good basketball team. They've got a lot of NBA players on Team Australia. A lot of good teams.
France is a good team.
France, Argentina.
Yeah.
You got some really, Spain usually has a pretty good team,
And I don't think there's many throwaway teams either because now you have, Japan has Rui now, these teams have NBA players now.
Yeah.
It's like.
And it can be argued, I think Joe Varden did an an article about it that some folks consider Luka Doncic the best player in the Olympic Games now. I don't necessarily agree with it. I still think it's
KD.
Kevin Durant. But we've seen Doncic with our own eyes. I'm not putting anything past him at 22 years old. So if he finds Slovenia and gets them to the podium, that's remarkable in and of itself, because they have no business being anywhere near
with 2 NBA players.
Exactly. Exactly. Given the talent that's on, some of these other teams, worldwide in the Olympics.
Do you have a prediction
for Slovenia?
Yeah. Well, for USA as well. Do you think USA is going to be upset here?
I think they'll win the gold. It'll be much more difficult. There will not be a cakewalk at all. I mean, their pool is pretty, generic. I think Iran and someone else and a couple other teams are in their pool, so they should get through pool play fairly easily. But once you start getting into the knockout rounds, the quarterfinals, and the knockout rounds, you got to bring your A game, because these teams are not playing. They want to give Team USA their best shot every single time they step on the floor with them. So it's not going to be a walk in the park at all for Team USA.
And as well, you got Booker, Middleton, and Holiday just being dropped into the fold out of the sky, basically.
Which is good for them, because let me tell you what I would not be doing after coming off of a 6-game NBA Finals, a grueling playoffs, and a season where the schedule was as compressed as it was, and injuries were taking a toll on these guys, knocking out some of the biggest stars in the game. I'm like, thanks, but no thanks, because I'm tired. I'm tired, and may have to try again in 4 years. But give credit to Middleton and Booker and Holiday for being willing to do that, because USA needs all the help they can get.
And Slovenia, bronze, possibly.
Why not?
Why not?
And it's strictly off the strength of
course, that
22-year-old wonder kid, playing basketball for him. Like, why not? Anything is possible, I feel like, at this point in life. At this point.
What about silver? Who do you think USA is going to play? Who do you think?
So I don't have a great handle on some of the other teams, but Australia is pretty strong. Right. Like, between Patty Mills, Joe Ingles, Thibault from the Sixers, like they've got some
Josh Green,
right? Yeah, no respect and no shade to Josh Green, of course, for the Mavericks, playing for team, but they got a good basketball team. Argentina is usually a pretty strong team. Spain, I did not know that Pau Gasol was out here playing for team Spain at like what 41
on Argentina.
Yeah, Scola's out here still playing ball. I'm like, these guys are old, man, but they're out here still kicking it. But I think those are some of the teams. At France, I mean, Rudy Gobert's playing for Team France.
Surprised we couldn't get Tony Parker out there for France.
Yeah, I'm surprised he didn't come out of retirement to come. I'm sure they would have welcomed him with open arms to come play too. I'm sure, but but
is there? Do you feel that the Mavs need to win a playoff series at minimum next year? Does that need to be the goal looking into next year? Does that need to be the goal?
I think so, because I think they're capable of it. I mean, honestly, they should have beaten the Clippers this season in my mind. So winning a playoff series is not out of the question. I mean, the West is tough and it's deep, and depending on what happens, with Kawhi and Chris Paul, there could be some real shakeup. Whether the Lakers decide to retool and try to go star hunting with guys like Westbrook or DeRozan or Lowry, depending on what happens there. The top of the West is going to be tough. And even the Dame situation in Portland, there could be some real shakeup, in the Western Conference this year. But you've got one of the 5 best players in the NBA on your team who clearly has shown a propensity to not be, dragged down when it comes to the moment. He has a flair for the dramatic and willing to put a team on his back. The question is, will his teammates come with him or be in a position to come with him in that way?
And I'm pretty sure you did a video on it, but do you foresee any humanly possibility of the Mavs trading for Dame?
No, I don't. I mean, the amount of assets required to me to try and get him, the Mavericks, I don't think have that now. stranger things have happened, but I don't see how they get there. And I don't know if necessarily Dame would want to come here. If to me, I would feel like he would want to get closer to home and play potentially with a team like the Golden State Warriors or something like that, being from Oakland and that kind of thing. Maybe Dame would want to get out there, but I don't necessarily see him coming here. It'd be fun to watch for sure, but no, I don't see him getting traded here.
And do you think we'll see the effects of Nico and kind of his relationships around the league? Do you think we'll see that immediately this offseason?
That's the goal, right? Because what's ironic about what the Mavericks have decided to do by hiring Nico Harrison is really kind of a continuation of a strategy that they've tried for the last 10-plus years, which is to go star hunting and hope that one or two of them bite and come here, because they don't have the kind of assets to make things happen, from a trade standpoint, or even if you look at the draft going forward, trying to build. Exactly. No draft picks this year. They have to go kind of continue down this road. So I guess if you're going to try and supercharge that strategy, why not go get a guy who has the kind of deep connections and relationships around the league from the grassroots level all the way to the professional ranks, and try and leverage some of that to get some of those guys to come here? Because right now that's really kind of the only mode of operation that you have, unless you get creative as a front office to be able to make some of those things happen. And that, to me, can the Mavericks get creative to try and make some of those moves to build around a situation where you don't necessarily have a lot of assets to really pull from?
The Luka KP story was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel it was blown out of proportion by the media? Do you feel that there's a legitimate rift? What is your read from everything you've been able to gather through this offseason, through covering the team? I know we didn't have intimate access, but you were on quite a few Zoom calls. What is your read?
I think it's a little overblown, to be honest with you. These are two very different individuals. Porzingis is much more stoic, much more businesslike. Not to say that he's not a guy that doesn't like to have a good time or that kind of thing, but he just goes about his business a little bit differently. Doncic is a mercurial 22-year-old hyper-competitive, star who loves to play video games and really just likes to chill and kick it. Like, that's just not who Porzingis is. The only thing that matters is that those two find the kind of chemistry on the court that their skill sets at times have shown is really good together. Like, Porzingis, for all of his flaws and all his deficiencies, there's not a lot of guys around the world who are 7'3", 7'4", who can stretch the floor from the three-point line the way that he does. And when he's really on and healthy, a guy that can get down and block shots and, be the kind of rim protector that, kind of what he was in New York. And, of course, we know what Doncic is and what he's still becoming. There's no reason why those two shouldn't be able to play well together offensively. It's just you don't have to be the best of friends, off the court necessarily to make the kind of music offensively that they should on the court. So will they ever be the best of friends? Probably not, but you don't necessarily have to be the best of friends in order to be able to have the kind of success on the floor that those two should be able to have, given the immense talent that both of them have. The question for Porzingis is, will he ultimately be able to stay healthy to have all that come to fruition for himself?
With the roster currently constructed as it is, if the Mavs do strike out, which has happened in the past,
Mm-hmm.
is it going to be a tough sell to the fan base, given what transpired here with Kidd and Nico?
It'll definitely raise a lot of questions, because these hires were built on relationships and the connections that Harrison has to those who are players that you could realistically see coming to this franchise based on who he is in the basketball world. And then with Kidd, a lot of this has been hinged on the idea Giannis has vouched for him. LeBron has vouched for him. You've got two of the biggest stars in the game vouching for a guy who's already a basketball Hall of Famer, who should theoretically be able to get more out of Luka Doncic given the positions that both of them play and the IQs that both of them possess, and being able to have that come to fruition on the floor. But you've got to be able to upgrade talent around Doncic to give Kid the idea that he's going to be put in the position to succeed, to make all of that happen. Because as much as I love Dorian Finney-Smith, super incredibly hard worker, Maxi Kleber, a guy who's developed and worked his way into being a credible NBA player, Jalen Brunson, who I really like as a player himself, smart basketball player, tough as nails. There's still roster upgrading that has to be done to give Mavericks fans, I think, the confidence to think that this franchise is going in the right direction. And that's not to knock what Brunson and Kleber and Dorian Finney-Smith and other guys who have been able to grow and develop in this franchise. It's just unfortunate right now it doesn't feel like they are all good enough to be part of a championship team at this point. There are certain characteristics of a Finney-Smith, a Kleber,
or at least mainstays.
Exactly, that you would want to have on your team. But there's no reason why Dorian Finney-Smith should have to be counted on in a 7-game series against the Los Angeles Clippers. There's no reason why we should be looking at Maxi Kleber as one of the turning points of a team needing him to come back because he's about to get out here and try and guard and defend Kawhi Leonard and Paul George to a certain extent. That ain't it. It's just, and that, again, that's no disrespect to what they've worked themselves to be as players in this league, but you've got to find a little bit better talent to be able to go up against the upper echelon of the Western Conference and the NBA in general.
Do you think Rick Carlisle hurt his legacy on the way out of the Mavs here?
Honestly, I don't think so, because at first it looked bad. Like the endorsement of Kidd while not endorsing Jamal Mosley on the way out, on its surface, that looked like a bad look. Now, what we've come to learn is, over the last few weeks, is that, Carlisle had been endorsing Jamal Mosley pretty much as soon as Steve, Clifford got fired or whatever happened with him in Orlando, that Jamal Mosley should be the next head coach of the Orlando Magic, and was vouching for him throughout the process. So maybe Carlisle knew that the Orlando job was a perfect fit for Mosley and wanted to advocate for him. Now, again, on its surface, it didn't look good at all. And the fact that he threw out Jason Kidd's name the way that he did, it raised a lot of eyebrows. Like, why in the world would you endorse a guy who may not necessarily be on the radar at the moment, but more importantly, a lot of folks, reported maybe Carlisle felt threatened by Moses' relationship and the great relationships that he had with his players and what that looked like going forward. It was pretty muddy how things, ended. But it sounds like Carlisle was doing his best, at least behind the scenes, to advocate for Mosley getting a job and calling him the Mike Tomlin of,
the NBA.
Of the NBA. That's a pretty
heavy endorsement.
High endorsement for a guy. So I don't like the way Carlisle handled it necessarily on the way out, but it sounds like some more.
Himself.
Yeah. The way out behind the scenes, it sounds like it became a little bit more clear on what was actually happening.
Right. Do we also? Here's another thing that wasn't raised at the presser: is why wasn't Mosley considered more? Do we need that question answered? Like, why was he good enough for Orlando but not good enough for Dallas, given the relationship with Luka?
Yeah.
The Mike Tomlin praise.
That was one of my biggest disappointments in the presser, was that there really was an opportunity for a lot of follow-up on a lot of the questions and issues that, fans and those who cover this team felt like needed to be answered, because I think that would have been a question, maybe not necessarily during the press conference itself, because, you do have the new head coach sitting right there. So to ask about, a guy who maybe thought should have gotten the job, who does now have a job in the league, may have not necessarily been the best time for it. But there were a lot of questions about, well, why didn't Mosley get the serious consideration that he thought he should have gotten, or folks on the outside looking in thought he should have gotten, based on his player development and relationships across the league and how widely respected Mosley is across NBA circles. So that to me was curious, but it sounded like from the beginning, especially when they brought Dirk Nowitzki in as a special advisor, like, okay, we kind of know what time it is with potentially who he may want, especially if he's going to have a heavy voice and presence in deciding or helping to decide who the next coach was going to be.
And not that Luka should be in charge of running the team, but my gut instinct is if you asked Luka, who do you want to be the next head coach, he probably would have said Jamal Mosley.
It's interesting who he would have said, because I think a lot of us looked at how much he worked with Mosley and the relationship they had with him and thought, oh, that's a natural fit and connection. But I don't know if you necessarily need to hire a coach solely on the basis of one relationship with one player, because that coach has got to show the ability to connect with all 12, 13, 15 of his guys, which we know that Mosley was really, well loved and liked by his team. You saw the reception that he got when he helped
the Knicks.
Yeah, the Knicks game, they won the game there, and how they received him. So I guess we'll never know at this point, I guess.
My man Kevin Gray, any final words, any shout-outs? I know, you've been killing the YouTube channel, Kevin Gray Sports, obviously 105.3 The Fan. Any final shout-outs?
Yeah. Please subscribe to Kevin Gray Sports on YouTube. I really appreciate that. You can catch me on our home of the Cowboys and Rangers, 105.3 The Fan, with my partner, the two-time Hall of Famer, Chris Arnold. And, yeah, man, covering the Mavs all summer long and into the season with free agency coming up. But definitely, if you want to get more from me, you can follow me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, Instagram the same. But definitely hit that subscribe button on Kevin Gray Sports on YouTube for sure.
Appreciate the time, my man.
You got it, man.